If you lost everything that defines who you are, your memories, your history, even your name, what would be left to guide you back to your true self? The sound of tires skidding on the snow made Alexander Scott grip the steering wheel tightly, feeling the adrenaline rush through his body. The storm lashed the deserted roads as he returned to his stately mansion on the outskirts of Aspen. The CEO of Scott Industries had spent the day in grueling meetings, protecting his company from yet another assault from longtime rival Arthur Blake. Now all he wanted was the cold silence of his home. But something, or someone, blocked the way. On the side of the road, an indistinct silhouette seemed bent under the weight of the wind. He braked sharply, huffing in frustration. Who in their right mind would be there in the middle of a storm? For a moment, he thought about ignoring it, but the sense of duty, or perhaps the guilt he always carried, made him stop the car. As Alexander approached, he noticed that it was a young woman, barefoot and wearing only a thin dress, clearly unsuitable for the weather. Snow covered part of her pale face, and she trembled as if the life was escaping her body. Without thinking twice, he wrapped her in his coat and carried her to the car, noticing her almost frightening likeness. In the mansion, the heat from the fireplace illuminated the stranger's face, now resting on the leather sofa. Alexander watched from afar, arms crossed and jaw clenched. Why would someone be so helpless in that place? He picked up the phone to call a doctor, but hesitated. Something about her fragility reminded him of memories he would rather bury. She woke up hours later, her eyes wide like those of a cornered animal. Trying to sit up, the young woman mumbled something inaudible. He approached, his hard expression softened by curiosity. "You're safe now," he said, trying to sound less intimidating. "Who are you?" I don't know," she replied, her voice breaking. His eyes wandered around the room, confused and scared. "My name, I don't remember." Alexander lay still, and discomfort growing in his chest. That amnesia seemed too convenient, as if it was hiding something. But at the same time, there was a sincerity in her fragility that disconcerted him. He sighed, realizing that his peaceful night was far from beginning. "Tomorrow we would find out who you are," he said, more for himself than for her. But something told him that this girl wasn't just a stranger lost in the snow. And so, without knowing it, Alexander Scott had just opened the doors to an enigma that would change his life forever. Morning came with an oppressive silence. Alexander woke up earlier than usual, but it wasn't work that got him out of bed that morning. It was the weight of the unknown presence in his home. Going downstairs, he found the room still in the dim light of dawn. On the couch, the young woman he had rescued the night before was sleeping soundly, her irregular breathing reflecting the discomfort of her condition. He approached slowly, observing her more closely. There was something about her that seemed both familiar and distant, like a forgotten fragment of a dream. The pale, delicate face had features that suggested a tumultuous history. Alexander, used to deciphering people in complex negotiations, found himself lost in front of her. He felt the urge to pull back the blanket covering his shoulders to see if there were any more injuries, but he restrained himself. Instead, his mind began to rationalize. Who was she? Why was he there, in that state? And why couldn't he shake the feeling that this woman was carrying something important with her, something that could shake his already unstable world? As the young woman began to awaken, Alexander noticed the tension in his own shoulders. He forced himself to soften his gaze as she slowly opened her eyes, her face contorting in confusion. "Do you remember anything?" he asked, his voice low but filled with expectation. She looked at him, her brown eyes teary and unsure. "I don't know. I can't remember anything. It's like everything is blacked out," she replied, her voice shaking with fear. The growing panic in her expression hit him in an unexpected way. Alexander was used to dealing with desperate people, but this was different. This wasn't someone begging for a favor or negotiating a deal. It was someone who was lost in a void he couldn't understand. "Take a deep breath," he said, trying to be steady. "You need to rest. I'll take care of it." "That?" she asked, barely audible, her voice carrying a disarming vulnerability. "That, who you are, where you came from." "Oh." He spoke as if he were giving an order, but inside something seemed to snap. He didn't know why he was committing himself, but he knew he couldn't ignore the situation. As she tried to compose herself, he walked away, calling his trusted doctor. He described the situation in minimal terms, avoiding mentioning the intensity of his emotions. A helpless young girl, amnesia, potential exposure to extreme cold. Come at once. After hanging up, Alexander found himself looking at his phone. Why me? He thought, frustrated. There were thousands of other people who could have passed that road. Why did she have to cross his path? As they waited for the doctor, the silence between them seemed to grow, filled with unspoken questions. You were alone on the road? He took a chance, breaking the silence. The young woman hesitated, frowning as if searching for answers in the void. I don't know. I think so. She shook her head, looking even more lost. Her every vague response was a reminder of her delicate situation. But it also brought out something in Alexander that he hadn't felt in years. Empathy. He walked away to make coffee, trying to calm his own thoughts. When the doctor arrived, Alexander watched closely as they examined her. Although her body was fragile, nothing seemed to indicate serious trauma. Just the cold, the tiredness, and a mind that somehow blocked out all memories. Amnesia can be temporary, the doctor explained, packing his bag, but she needs rest and support. The brain sometimes shuts down to protect the person. Protect? Alexander repeated, fixing his eyes on the doctor. Yes, usually from something traumatic. He looked at him seriously before saying goodbye. The word echoed in Alexander's mind long after the doctor left. Trauma. It was something he knew all too well. He had no idea what this young woman had faced, but he knew it wasn't something she could face alone. Returning to the living room, he found her sitting, her eyes fixed on the snow-covered window. Thank you, she said, without looking at him, for helping me. You don't need to thank me. His voice was firm, but inside he felt something strange, something that resisted being identified. Let's find out who you are. As he said this, he felt a silent promise being made. No matter what happened, he would not leave this woman alone in the chaos of her own mind. The clock on the wall showed 7 in the evening, but Alexander barely noticed the time passing. Sitting in his living room, with a forgotten glass of wine at his side, his eyes followed the hesitant movements of the young woman he had rescued. She seemed lost between the fire in the fireplace and the shadows of the room, as if she didn't know where she belonged. Since the doctor's diagnosis, he had remained vigilant, a vigilance that he would not admit even to himself to be motivated by anything other than obligation. She had still revealed nothing more than disjointed fragments, and Alexander was beginning to realize that his own patience was being tested. You still haven't told me your name, she commented suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence like a curious murmur. Alexander looked away from the fire, surprised by the question. He hesitated for a moment, not used to revealing anything personal, even something so simple. Alexander Scott, he replied, his voice deep, almost as if he were introducing himself to an adversary. Scott. The name seemed to echo in her mind, her eyes darkening for a brief second before her expression returned to blank confusion. I think I've heard that name before. Her reaction came as a shock to Alexander. He sat up straighter, watching her as if he could read the thoughts she was struggling to remember. Where? When? I don't know. It's like a feeling, but I can't reach it, she admitted, her voice shaking. This confession awakened a mixture of frustration and an unexpected pang of compassion in Alexander. He stood up abruptly, the fabric of his impeccably pressed shirt moving with his pent-up tension. I'm going to make coffee. You should eat something. But it wasn't just that. He needed to get out of that room. He needed space to process the wave of conflicting emotions she was awakening. In the kitchen, as he prepared coffee, Alexander found himself reliving the details of what she had said. The idea that she knew his name was unsettling. After all, his name was widely associated with the Scott Industries Corporation and the notorious rivalry with the Blakes. He felt a chill as he considered the possibility that she might be linked to this dispute. Back in the room, he found the young woman still sitting, her eyes fixed on her hands, as if they were searching for answers there. When he placed the cup of coffee in front of him, she looked up, thanking him with a shy smile that took him by surprise. Why did you help me? She asked, her voice filled with sincere curiosity. Alexander hesitated, the weight of the question hitting him unexpectedly. He didn't have a simple answer, at least not one he was willing to admit. Because you were there, because no one else would do it, he replied, simplistic but direct. She looked down, playing with the cup in her hands. "I don't think I've ever had anyone care like this." These words, spoken with a mixture of melancholy and resignation, sank deep into Alexander. He felt a tightness in his chest, as if he was seeing a part of himself reflected in it. Her loneliness, although different from his, felt all too familiar. "You need to rest," he said, trying to change the tone of the conversation. "Tomorrow, we'll see how we can move forward." She nodded, but there was something about the way she looked at him before leaving the room that made him feel like she saw more than he was willing to show. When Alexander was finally alone, he sat down again, feeling the weight of the night on his shoulders. He knew there was something more to this young girl. She was a mystery that he needed to unravel, but at the same time, something inside him warned him. Perhaps the answers were more dangerous than he could imagine. Alexander woke up before dawn, as was his wont. But that morning, something seemed different. The usual silence of his mansion was interrupted by soft sounds coming from the kitchen. He walked down the stairs, his footsteps echoing off the polished wooden walls as he tried to decipher what he was hearing. There she was, wearing an oversized sweater, which he had left in the guest room, and moving awkwardly around the kitchen, as if he were in unfamiliar territory. A pot creaked on the stove, and a subtle smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. "You should be resting," he said, crossing his arms at the door and watching her. His voice came out harsher than he intended, but it was difficult to shake off the armor he wore so well. She turned quickly with a start. "Oh, I thought I could give back a little. I didn't want to be a bother," she replied, her expression torn between nervousness and a shy desire to please. Alexander walked to the table and picked up the cup of coffee she had prepared, evaluating it with a critical eye. He took a sip, feeling the bitterness of the liquid. "At least you know how to make coffee," he murmured, trying to hide the slight smile that threatened to appear. She laughed softly, a sound that took him by surprise. It was the first time he had seen her relax, even if for a brief moment. That sound, simple and genuine, made something stir inside him, something he didn't want to name. As they drank coffee in silence, Alexander glanced at her. His movements were cautious, but there was a delicate strength to his presence. She wasn't just a victim. There was something more, something he couldn't identify but that intrigued him deeply. "Have you tried to remember anything else?" he asked, breaking the silence. She nodded, her face scrunching up in frustration. "I tried, but everything is like a blur. I have flashes, little things, but nothing makes sense." "What kinds of things?" She hesitated, playing with the handle of her cup before answering. "A voice, rough but familiar, a perfume." And she paused, as if trying to collect her thoughts. "A symbol. I think it was a brand. A circle with something inside." Alexander's heart quickened, but his face remained impassive. He was familiar with corporate symbols and logos, and her description was not strange. It was the emblem of Blake Enterprises, the rival company he so despised. He stood up abruptly, leaving the cup on the table. "Stay here. I have work to do," he said, his voice as cold as ice. She looked at him with confusion and a hint of hurt. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," he replied without turning around. "Just stay here." Going up to his office, Alexander tried to organize the thoughts that now flooded him. If she was indeed linked to the Blakes, that meant trouble. Trouble he didn't know if he wanted to face. He opened his laptop and began searching for information about the Blake family, combing through old files, news reports, and reports. One name caught his attention: Emily Blake, Arthur Blake's missing daughter, presumed dead years ago in an alleged kidnapping. The connection was impossible to ignore. He analyzed old photos of Emily, looking for any similarities. The traces were vague, but the possibility was real. Back in the kitchen, the young woman was washing the dishes when Alexander entered. He leaned against the counter, his eyes fixed on her. "I need you to trust me," he said, with a gravity that caught your attention. "I trust," she replied, even if her voice carried a slight tremor. "There's something we need to investigate. Something about you." She frowned, clearly nervous. "About me?" Alexander nodded, feeling the weight of what he was about to say. He couldn't tell everything. "Not yet. I just want to help you discover the truth." In the days that followed, Alexander began to observe every detail of her more closely. Small habits, reactions to certain stimuli. He noticed how she avoided mirrors, as if she were afraid of what she might see. How his eyes sparkled ever so slightly when he talked about little fragments of memories that surfaced. Between these observations came moments of unexpected intimacy. During a storm, the power went out in the mansion, and the two were trapped in the living room, lit only by candlelight. She told him about the emptiness she felt, and he, against his own nature, shared a little of his story, about how he lost his parents in an accident and how that shaped his life. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice low but full of sincerity. "Because no one helped me when I needed it," he replied, his voice so honest it took him by surprise. That night, when they both retired to their rooms, Alexander felt something different. She was leaving marks on his life, and he knew that, whether he wanted to or not. The bond that was being formed between them would be difficult to break. The sharp night winds howled against the mansion's windows, echoing like an omen. Alexander was in the office, eyes fixed on the computer screen. In front of him, photos of Emily Blake flickered between old reports and news articles. Every detail, the girl's soft smile, the shape of her eyes, seemed to align unsettlingly with the young woman who now slept in her home. He closed the laptop with a sharp movement, as if he could shake off the suffocating thoughts that invaded his mind. If she really was Emily Blake, everything would change. It wasn't just the weight of dealing with the missing daughter of his greatest rival, but the implication that her presence could be a threat, however unintentional. Alexander ran his hands over his face, feeling the tension in every muscle. Why was this happening now? He had built his life on a fierce rivalry with Arthur Blake, and fate seemed determined to turn his certainties upside down. As he fought through his confusion, light footsteps echoed in the hallway. He glanced at the open door, seeing her there, hesitant, as if afraid to interrupt him. "I heard noises. I thought you might need something," she said, her voice soft, almost apologetic. Alexander took a deep breath, trying to hide the storm raging inside him. "I am not well. Go back to bed," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. But she didn't move. Her eyes, large and restless, studied him as if they could see beyond his facade. "You are worried about something. I can feel it," she said, with a frankness that disarmed him. "It's none of your business," he replied, getting up from his chair and crossing the room towards the window. He looked at the vast snow-covered field, wishing to find answers in the void. She took a step forward, the lightness of her movements almost imperceptible in the silence of the office. "I know I'm a burden. You helped me when I didn't need to, and I only brought more problems into your life. But I want to understand. I want to remember." Her words hit him like a punch. He turned to face her, seeing determination mixed with fear on her face. "What do you want to remember?" he asked, voice lower now, almost a whisper. "Everything," she replied, her eyes teary. "Who I am. Why am I here? Because I feel like there's something terrible I can't achieve." Alexander felt a pang in his chest, a mix of empathy and self-preservation. He wanted to protect her, but he knew that in doing so, he could be opening a door to something he couldn't control. So he made a decision. "Tomorrow, we'll start looking for answers," he said, his voice firm. "There are places and people that can help us." She nodded, relief evident in her eyes. "Thank you, Alexander," she said, almost whispering, before leaving. When the door closed, he was alone again. But something had changed. He wasn't just dealing with a riddle. Now there was an implied promise. He was committed to uncovering the truth. Even if it meant confronting ghosts from the past, he'd rather leave buried. The next morning, the plan began to take shape. Alexander decided to contact an old friend, a private investigator who owed him favors. The visit would be discreet, away from the eyes of anyone who might arouse suspicion. As they prepared to leave, he noticed something peculiar. The young woman was holding a small medallion that seemed to have slipped out of her pocket. It was a simple object, but loaded with meaning. "Where did you find this?" he asked, pointing to the locket. She looked at it, surprised, as if she hadn't realized she had it in her hands. "I don't know. It was with me when I woke up that night." Alexander took the locket and examined it. It was antique, with a delicate engraved design, a circle surrounding a stylized flower. His heart raced. He had seen that symbol before, in one of Arthur Blake's documents. Without saying a word, he put the medallion in his pocket. The connection was becoming clearer, but he still needed concrete proof. On the way to the investigator, the tension in the car was palpable. She looked out the window, restless, while he kept his gaze fixed on the road. The unspoken words between them created a heavy silence. When they arrived, the investigator, a middle-aged man with discerning eyes, greeted them with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Alexander explained the bare minimum, presenting the locket and describing her situation without going into too much detail. The investigator looked at the young woman carefully, as if trying to decipher a puzzle. "I'll need time," he said, analyzing the locket more carefully. "But I can say that this is not common. It's connected to something important, something old." As they left, Alexander felt the weight of uncertainty growing. Each step toward the truth seemed riskier, more dangerous. But now there was no turning back. Back at the mansion, the young woman looked at him, her eyes full of questions she didn't yet know how to ask. Alexander just nodded, as if silently saying, "Trust me." And for the first time in years, he realized he was taking a risk not for business, but for something much deeper. The sky was dyed an oppressive gray as Alexander parked the car in the mansion's driveway. The strong wind threw snow against the windows, but the cold he felt didn't come from outside. It was internal, a feeling that something dangerous was about to happen, a feeling he couldn't ignore. The young woman beside her was silent, her hands clasped in her lap. Since visiting the investigator, something seemed different about her. A mix of tension and expectation, as if she were on the verge of a revelation that could change everything. Alexander opened the car door and looked at her. "Are you ready?" he asked, more as a formality than an actual necessity. She nodded, her wide eyes reflecting both fear and determination. As they walked through the snow to the door, Alexander found himself questioning, once again, why he had become so deeply involved. He didn't do that. He didn't care about anyone but himself. At least, that's what he always believed. Inside the mansion, he'd enveloped them, but the tension between them remained. She went up to her room, while he went straight to the office, where he anxiously awaited a call from the investigator. The locket was on the table, reflecting the soft light from the lamp, a small object that seemed to carry the weight of a million questions. When the phone finally rang, Alexander answered immediately. On the other end of the line, the investigator sounded hesitant, almost cautious. "Scott, there's something you need to know," he began, his voice low. "This medallion is more than an antique object. It is a symbol used exclusively by the Blake family in private documents, especially confidential contracts." Alexander leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. "And that means?" "It means she is connected to them. Maybe not directly, but there is a clear connection. Furthermore, there is an interesting detail. The circle pattern around the flower is unique and was only used in a specific document." "Which document?" Alexander asked, his voice firm, even though he felt the air leaving his lungs. "The adoption contract for Emily Blake, the missing daughter." The words echoed in the silence of the office like thunder. Alexander felt a tightness in his chest, confirmation of something he already suspected, but which now seemed an impossible truth to avoid. When he hung up, he stared at the phone in his hands. He should feel triumphant. After all, that meant he had the key to destabilizing his biggest rival. But instead he felt a growing uneasiness. If she was really Emily Blake, what did that mean to her? For them? He walked up the stairs, the locket still in his hand, and stopped in front of her room. He knocked lightly on the door, hearing a murmur of permission before entering. She was sitting on the bed, her knees bent and her arms wrapped around her legs, like a lost child. When he saw the medallion in his hand, his eyes fixed on it, almost hypnotized, he asked, holding the locket between his fingers. She hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't know, but I feel like it's important," he replied, his voice a broken whisper. Alexander sat on the edge of the bed, something in him softening at her vulnerability. He had never been a man of kind gestures, but at that moment, he placed the locket in her hands, allowing her to hold it. "There's a chance it's connected to his family," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I need you to trust me. We will find out the truth, but it may not be what you expect." She looked up at him, the tears finally falling, but she didn't look so lost anymore. She looked prepared. "Thank you for not giving up on me," she said, her voice filled with genuine emotion. That night, while she slept, Alexander lay awake in the office, combing through everything he could about Emily Blake's case. The connections were becoming clearer, but also more dangerous. If Arthur Blake discovered that his daughter was alive and under Alexander's roof, it could trigger a war that went far beyond corporate rivalry. The next morning, the snowstorm had subsided, but the weather inside the mansion was thicker than ever. Alexander decided it was time to take the next step. He had arranged a meeting with a contact who could confirm her identity for good, but he also knew that would put them on the wrong people's radar. As he prepared to leave, she appeared in the room, the locket tied around her neck with a makeshift chain. "I'm ready," she said, and Alexander realized that, for the first time, he wasn't just talking about going out to investigate. She was ready to face whatever was necessary. He nodded, his respect for her growing. "Let's go," he said, and together they walked out the door, ignoring the cold that seemed insignificant in the face of the storm they knew was coming. The sound of Alexander and the young woman's footsteps echoed in the long corridor of an inconspicuous building in the city center. The walls were gray, with cold lighting and a heavy atmosphere, as if the place held secrets that no one wanted to reveal. Alexander was silent, his muscles tense as he guided the young woman. She, in turn, seemed to fight the fear that was rising in her throat. But her steps, although hesitant, did not stop. At the end of the hallway, a worn wooden door awaited them. Alexander knocked twice, the sound resounding like thunder in the silence. The door was opened by a middle-aged man with gray hair and thin glasses, whose expression conveyed tiredness but also a dangerous cunning. Scott greeted the man in a hoarse voice, before looking at the young woman. "This must be." He left the sentence hanging, but the prolonged look said it all. "She's here for answers," Alexander interrupted, with a firm tone that seemed to contain a warning. They entered the small office, which was crammed with papers and folders. Alexander pulled out a chair for the young woman, who sat down slowly, her eyes wandering over the documents as if searching for some clue there. He remained standing, as if his presence could protect her from whatever came her way. The man, identified only as Harris, began examining the locket. He adjusted his glasses and took a magnifying glass from his pocket, analyzing every detail with almost obsessive precision. The young woman watched, her shaking hands resting in her lap. "This pattern is unmistakable," Harris said after a few minutes, breaking the silence. "He belongs to the main lineage of the Blake family." The young woman gasped, her breathing quickening. Alexander placed a firm hand on his shoulder, a gesture he hadn't planned, but that came almost instinctively. "What else can you tell us?" Alexander asked, trying to keep his voice calm, even though inside he was on high alert. Harris removed a folder from a cabinet, scattering documents on the table. "There is something even more interesting. This medallion is not just a symbol, it's a key, an identifier used in high confidentiality contracts. I tracked down the last document that used this symbol, Emily Blake's adoption certificate, made under seal after her kidnapping." The name echoed in the room like a bomb. Emily Blake. The young woman stood frozen, the words seeming to spin around in her mind without finding a place to settle. Am I Emily?" she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief and a hint of dread. Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the revelation. He knew that possibility was real, but hearing the words out loud made everything more concrete, more inevitable. Harris continued, oblivious to the emotional turmoil in the room. "If she really is Emily Blake, then she's not just an heiress. She is the missing link in a family war. His reappearance changes everything, not just for the Blake family, but for you, Scott." The man looked at Alexander with an intensity that was almost a challenge. "Are you prepared for the consequences?" Alexander didn't respond immediately. He looked at the young woman, at Emily, and saw the confusion, the fear, and the pain in her eyes. She was processing a truth that could change her entire identity, and he knew how he acted in that moment would be crucial. "No matter the consequences," he finally replied, with a firmness that surprised even himself, "I will protect her." The words were simple, but carried with a weight that he still didn't fully understand. He knew his decision put him in a dangerous position, but he couldn't go back. Emily stood up, her eyes shining with tears she was trying to hold back. "I need time," she said. almost begging. "I need to think, understand what this means." Alexander nodded, respecting her space. They left Harris' office in silence, the revelation still echoing among them. Back at the mansion, Emily went straight to her bedroom, while Alexander stayed in the living room. Sitting in front of the fireplace, staring into the flames, he thought about what would come next. The rivalry with Arthur Blake, which was already deadly serious, was now about to become something much more personal. He knew that by protecting Emily, he would be declaring war in a way he had never done before. But at the same time, he felt something unexpected, a desire to be by her side, not just as a protector, but as someone who understood her pain, her search for identity. That night, as the silence reigned in the mansion, Alexander made a decision. No matter who was Emily Blake or what her past meant, she wouldn't be alone. Emily stared at the mirror in her room, but the woman who saw reflected looked strange. The revelation of his true identity pulsed into his mind as an incessant echo. Emily Blake. Her name carried a weight she didn't know how to endure. A story that wasn't hers, but now she defined her. His fingers touched the locket hanging around his neck, as if that small object could give the answers he needed so much. Every detail that came to light, the symbol, the documents, the name, seemed to push it into an abyss of uncertainty. But what terrified her most was the question I couldn't get away. Who am I really? Outside the room, Alexander passed the hallway, his heavy steps echoing against the walls. He stopped in front of Emily's door, hesitating for a moment before knocking lightly. "Enter," she said, her voice weak but determined. He entered, finding her sitting on the edge of the bed, her red eyes from crying, but still full of determination. For a moment he just watched her, saying nothing. It was difficult for him to express empathy. His words were always calculated, designed to master negotiations and not to comfort broken hearts. But with Emily, he felt he needed to try something different. "How are you?" he finally asked, his low voice. She laughed, a brief and bitter sound. "How do you think I'm, Alexander? I find out that my whole life was a lie, that I have a family that didn't even know it existed, and that I'm in the midst of a war one didn't choose to fight." Alexander nodded, accepting the intensity of his words. "I understand, but you don't have to deal with it alone, Emily." She looked up at him, something in his expression softening when he heard his name. "Thank you, Alexander. I don't know what you would have done without you." For a moment, the silence between them was filled with something more, a connection they both felt, but they still couldn't name. He approached, sitting beside her. "I need you to know," he started, his firmer voice now, "that regardless of what happens next, you can trust me. This is not about the Blake or about my rivalry with Arthur. It's about you." The words, simple and straightforward, played Emily deeply. She held her hand, a small but meaningful gesture. "Thank you," she said again, this time with more conviction. While Emily tried to process her emotions, Alexander was already planning her next steps. He knew that Arthur Blake would not stand still if he discovered the truth. The question was, how to protect Emily without exposing her even more. That afternoon, Alexander called Harris, asking him to investigate discreetly how Arthur Blake could react to the news of Emily's return. He also reinforced safety in the mansion, instructing his team to maintain constant vigilance. Each movement was now a strategic move, and he could not afford to make a luxury. Emily, in turn, began to explore the fragments of her memory with more determination. She spent hours in her room, looking at old photos and trying to pull anything that could confirm who she was before the accident that led her to amnesia. With each piece of the puzzle that did not fit, frustration grew, but also its strength. One night, while Alexander worked in his office, Emily entered, holding a yellowish sheet of paper that she had found among the documents provided by Harris. It was a children's drawing of a large house with a woman and a child holding hands. She handed the roll to Alexander, her eyes full of hope. "I think I was the one who drew it," she said. "It's my mother, and this, I think it's me." Alexander looked at the drawing, feeling a twinge of something he could not identify. It was a glimpse of who Emily was, but also a painful reminder of what she had lost. "If this is true, it means that you were connected to them before the kidnapping," he said, looking at her. "This doesn't change who you are now, Emily." She smiled, a weak but genuine smile. I think I'm starting to believe it. But even as Emily was beginning to accept her new reality, the shadows of danger approached. One of Alexander's guards reported that there were suspicious movements near the mansion, slowly passing cars, as if they were watching. Alexander knew this could only mean one thing. Someone knew where Emily was. That night he gathered his security team and gave clear orders. No information about Emily should leave this place. If someone tries to enter, I want to know immediately. While winter winds howled outside, Emily felt unusual calm inside the mansion. She knew she was safe with Alexander, but also understood that this safety was fragile, a delicate balance that could crumble at any time. Alexander, in turn, knew that time was running out. He needed to prepare Emily for what she would come, but more than that, she needed to face her own feelings. Because deep down, he knew that protecting Emily was not just a matter of honor, it was much more personal. The dawn came slowly, dyeing the sky with orange tones and throwing shadows over the snow around the mansion. Alexander watched through the office window. The jaw crashed while the first rays of sun reflected in the glass. He knew that this would be the day that everything would change. The information had arrived the night before. Arthur Blake was moving. A reliable source had confirmed that the tycoon was aware that Emily, or at least someone who corresponded to her description, was alive and under Alexander's protection. It was no longer a matter of whether Blake would take measurements, but when. Emily, oblivious to the intense movement that happened around her, descended the stairs for breakfast. Its expression was lighter, but it still carried a trace of uncertainty. The time she had spent in the mansion had given her a sense of security she didn't know she needed. But she also increased her awareness that this peace was temporary. Alexander was already at the table, reviewing papers with an intensity that made the environment seem heavier. "Good morning," said Emily, sitting in front of him. He looked up, and for a moment, something in his gaze softened. "Good morning," he replied, but his voice was loaded with a weight he couldn't disguise. She realized but decided not to press him. The silence between them was comfortable, but full of understood. She knew that there was more happening than he was willing to share, but she also knew that Alexander would always protect her, even if she had to carry the burden on her own. While the day was advancing, Alexander gathered his team in a downstairs. He explained the situation directly, but not alarmist, outlining a plan to reinforce the security around the property. But even with the precautions, he knew that the true confrontation would not be avoided for long. When he returned to the living room, he found Emily looking out the window, her eyes fixed on the horizon. It seemed thoughtful, almost melancholy. "What are you thinking?" he asked, approaching slowly. "I never imagined my life like this," she answered, without looking away. "It is as if I was stuck between two lives that are not completely mine." Alexander was silent for a moment, absorbing his words. So with a sigh, he said, "You don't have to be defined by your past, Emily. You have the power to choose who wants to be now." She finally looked at him, her eyes shining with emotion. "Thank you, Alexander. I think that of all the things that happened, you are the only one that makes sense." He felt the impact of these words, something deep and undeniable. Without thinking, he held her hand, a simple gesture, but meaningful. "And you, Emily, make more sense than anything I have ever known." The moment was interrupted by an urgent knock on the door. One of the security guards entered, his face tense. "Mr. Scott, unknown cars are approaching the property." The environment was immediately charged. Alexander dropped Emily's hand and went to the security guard with an authority that left no room for hesitation. "Get ready. I want eyes at all entry points." Emily tried to follow him, but he turned, the expression firm. "Stay here. Don't go out for anything." "But Alexander..." "Emily, trust me," he said, his soft but uncompromising voice. "I will resolve this." She nodded reluctantly and watched as he left the room. His heart was rapid, and a wave of fear spread throughout his body. But at the same time, there was something more unshakable confidence in Alexander. Outside, Alexander was standing at the entrance of the mansion, surrounded by his security guards. He saw the cars stop at a safe distance, and the first vehicle came out. Arthur Blake. The man was as imposing as Alexander remembered, with the air of someone used to controlling everything around him. "Scott," said Blake, his severe voice cutting the cold air. "It seems that you found something that belongs to me." Alexander stepped forward, his eyes fixed on his rival. "It doesn't belong to you, Blake. No more." Blake gave a cold smile, but his eyes didn't hide their anger. "This is not your decision." Emily, who was hidden behind a window, watched the scene with her heart in her throat. She could feel the weight of the confrontation, but she also knew that this was the time when she would need a decision. Before someone could stop her, she went out the front door, her unexpected presence interrupting the tension between the two men. "Blake," she began, her firm voice despite the fear she felt. "If I'm Emily Blake, then I'm also the owner of my destination, and I am not an object that can be disputed." The impact of his words reverberated on silence. Alexander looked at her, a mixture of pride and concern in her eyes. Blake seemed momentarily speechless, but soon recovered his composure. "Very well, Emily," he said, his smoother voice now, but still loaded with manipulation. "If this is true, you have a lot to recover." "Perhaps," she answered, with a courage that surprised herself, "but that doesn't mean I trust you." Blake narrowed his eyes, but before he could answer, Alexander stepped forward, placing himself between the two. "You heard what she said. Now leave." After a tense moment, Blake returned to his car, but not without first launching a last look at Emily. This is not over yet. As the cars disappeared at the distance, Emily felt the weight of the moment to fall on her. Alexander approached, holding his shoulders firmly. "You were amazing," he said, his voice full of admiration. "Thank you," she answered, looking at him gratefully. "But I know this is just the beginning, and I will be with you in every step of the way," promised Alexander, with a sincerity that she never doubted. The snow was beginning to melt, revealing the damp floor around the mansion. It was as if winter, which had brought so many uncertainties, was finally giving way to a new season. Emily was in the garden, watching the horizon, where the mountains still kept her white peaks. The cold breeze shook her hair, but she hardly felt the cold. Inside it was a growing heat, a mixture of hope and courage that supported it. The night before, Alexander had sat with her in the room, the fire of the fireplace throwing soft shadows on his face. He had explained what would come next, the steps they needed to take to make sure it was safe, and so that his identity was not used as an Arthur Blake gun. Despite the uncertainties, there was a firmness in his voice that reassured her. Not only did he promise to protect her, he had promised to be by her side, no matter what happened. Now Alexander was in the office, finalizing the documents that would give Emily the freedom to decide how he wanted to reconnect himself to the world. He had negotiated with lawyers and even reluctantly established clear limits with Arthur Blake. Blake accepted the truce, but Alexander knew this was not a definitive end. He could only trust that Emily was strong enough to deal with the future, because he would always be there to support her. Emily entered the office, the light steps echoing on the wooden floor. Alexander looked up at his work, his eyes softening as he found her. "It's all ready," he said, pointing to a folder on the table. She looked at the folder, but didn't catch her immediately. Instead, he approached Alexander and stood beside him. "Thank you," she said, her voice low but full of emotion. "I don't know what you would have done without you." Alexander got up, facing her. His height and presence were almost intimidating, but for Emily, he was the anchor that kept her firm in a world that still seemed constantly changing. "You would have found a way," he answered, his voice as safe as his posture. "Because you are strong, Emily. Much more than you imagine." She looked at him, her eyes shining with unhealthy tears. There were so many words that she meant, but none looked enough. Instead, she stepped ahead and hugged him, the gesture surprising both. Alexander, who rarely allowed someone to break his barriers, was still for a moment before relaxing, his hands resting on her back in a hug that said more than any word could convey. When she finally walked away, there was a shy smile on her face. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice-laden voice and a touch of fear. "Now you decide," Alexander replied, with a softness that it rarely showed. "You have a family waiting for you, but you also have the right to choose how you want to live your life." She nodded, absorbing her words. It was not a simple choice, but she knew that for the first time she had control, and that was something no one could take from her. That afternoon, Alexander led her to an away cabin, where Arthur Blake had agreed to find her under strict conditions. Emily was nervous but determined. Seeing Blake, he felt a wave of conflicting emotions: fear, curiosity, and, unexpectedly, compassion. Blake, in turn, seemed disconcerted. He, the always imposing man, hesitated before approaching her. "Emily," he began, his voice loaded with repressed emotion. "I'm very sorry." She was silent for a moment, before responding with an unexpected calm. "I don't know if I can forgive everything, but I'm willing to listen." The meeting was brief, but essential. Emily left the cabin knowing that there was still much to resolve, but she also felt she was ready to face what she came from, whether with her family or on her own. Back in the mansion, the mood was lighter. Emily met Alexander in the room where he was serving 2 glasses of wine. He handed him one, the touch of his fingers sending a wave of comfort through it. "To the future," he said, raising the glass in a simple but significant gift. "To the future," she answered, with a smile that now seemed more confident. While the night fell, Emily and Alexander sat in front of the fireplace, talking about possibilities, laughing at small moments, and for the first time in a long time, feeling that the world was not so scary. And so, as the flames crackled and the snow melted outside, they found a beginning. Not an end, but a fresh start, full of uncertainty, but also of hope.